Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is well. Thank you for this opportunity to do this presentation on, it's a very high-level presentation on cyber security auditing. I guess the first thing that we need to do is maybe just look at what we are going to cover today. So Fred, if you can just move to the next slide. So we will cover a very brief introduction around cybersecurity. We'll look at applicable standards that we usually use when we do our cyber audits. We'll look at the various cyber risks, the main risks that we find at specifically at clients. Then we're going to go into just on a very high level what we do in terms of vulnerability assessments, technical firewall assessments. We'll cover security and layers, and then also look at cybersecurity controls auditing. And a very important issue that we also just need to cover is around the human weakness and how that affects our cybersecurity. Okay, so let's move into that introduction. So as you can see on the screen there's a lot of terms there, depending on where you sit in IT, or maybe not at all. Some of these things might seem a bit foreign. Things like network sniffing, cyber warfare, password cracking, these all sound very scary. And the truth of the matter is that these various terms are all terms that hackers use, tools and techniques that hackers use to gain access to your personal information or organization's information. Next slide. So just in a very practical definition, cybersecurity is effectively how we defend ourselves in terms of personal computer servers, mobile devices, systems, networks, from malicious or inadvertent attacks. And we also refer to it as ICT security. That's what we used to call it 5 years ago. But now, if you look at all of the audit plans that are out there, there's definitely been a shift to really focus on cybersecurity. In terms of the categories that we get network security, application security, data security, mobile security, operational security. We also place a large focus on disaster recovery and business continuity. And then, as I've mentioned before, end user education and awareness also plays a really important role when we look at cybersecurity. So that, just on a very high level, is cybersecurity. Let's have a look at the standards that we use. We make use of effectively two sets of standards when we do our cybersecurity audits or reviews. The first one, which is the one that I prefer, it's not saying that it's better than anything else. It's just in terms of my own personal preference, is the NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that is based in the USA, and they develop cybersecurity standards, guidelines, and best practices. And they also provide a lot of white papers and information for people to go and read up about and make sure that their cybersecurity is suit for purpose. It basically meets the needs of US industry, federal agency, as well as the broader public. And the core functions that we find in the NIST standard is basically identity, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Fred, if you can just move on to the next slide. So this is our NIST cybersecurity framework. Like I said, we've got identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And what you'll see under each one, there's a few key items or a few key controls that we would usually look at during our cyber type reviews. In terms of specifically when we do vulnerability assessments, that will fall under your detect, the yellow area there, where you see the detection processes. We run various tools to find vulnerabilities within the environment, and we report on them in that way. In terms of identify, I'm just very briefly going to provide you some information about the 5 key areas. In terms of identify, if we don't know what we have or why we have it, we can't protect it. In terms of protection, we want to put as many controls in place as possible, things like passwords, data security, protective technologies, awareness and training. All of these things fall under the protect banner. In terms of detection, we want to have as many ways of detecting intrusions or risks within our environment. This we can do by implementing automated software, or we can rely on our users to provide us feedback on things that they might see or encounter when interacting with the IT systems. In terms of response, this is where our response planning comes in. How do we communicate? How do we analyze? How do we mitigate? And how do we improve our security posture? And then in terms of recovery, this is where your DRP and business continuity type plans come into effect. Right, let's move on to the ISO 27001 standard. So this is a international standard. I'm sure everyone is familiar with ISO type standards. You get them for most control environments out there. And basically, we have 114 controls that are divided into 14 domains in the ISO standard. Next slide. And here you can see the different control areas that we have, everything from compliance to cryptography, supplier relationships, access control, asset management, all these types of controls will, at the end of the day, assist you in terms of strengthening your security posture. Next slide. Okay, let's look at the main risks. So generally, when we deal with clients and we write reports and we list risks and those sorts of things, the main risks basically come down to 4 key areas. Excuse me, which are a loss of reputation, business loss or loss of confidence, loss of revenues, actual and consequential, and then compromised information. So all of these risks we see now almost on a weekly basis. There's some major organization or company within South Africa that is getting hacked. And once that information reaches the media, people become very aware of it. And in today's age, if I cannot trust an organization to keep my information private, I will no longer use that organization. So that's our reputational risk. Business loss or loss of confidence, very much linked to the reputation. And then once we have business loss or loss of confidence, we'll have loss of revenues and compromised information. Excuse me. It can lead to severe consequences. We have things like identity theft, financial losses, reputational damage, and a very real risk is the legal and compliance issues in terms of compromised information. So when we do our cyber reviews, the main objective is always to make sure that we address these risks in some way or another to ensure that we don't have any risk realization in terms of these 4 areas. Next slide. Right. Vulnerability assessments. I can talk about this for the whole day, but I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. So we use a scanning tool called Nessus Professional. It is one of the best vulnerability detection systems out there. Some of the other vulnerability assessment tools that are on par with Nessus is things like Nexpose, and then some of the Linux-based tools that you get. But in terms of Nessus Professional, you can see this was just a scan summary on a very vulnerable machine that I did, and it is able to detect the operating system, whether there's issues with the operating system, whether there's issues with the communication protocols, the device type, the card manufacturer, all of these things it's able to detect, and it's able to identify any weaknesses in any configuration or operating system within the environment. Where it becomes tricky with vulnerability assessments is the reporting to clients. You know, it is very easy to give a client a list of 1,000 vulnerabilities or 10,000 vulnerabilities and tell them they should go and implement all of our recommendations, but that is not the best way to do these types of assessments, and it's not the best way to do the reporting. So in terms of reporting, next slide, Fred. In terms of reporting, there's a couple of key factors that we want to identify. So first, we want to identify the number of IP addresses that were scanned. So we will scan an entire network or network ranges within an environment. And based on the scanning tool, it will identify all of the active hosts or active IP addresses on that particular network. The next thing that we want to know is the number of unique critical, high, medium, and low vulnerabilities that were identified. So just to quickly explain to you what a unique vulnerability is. So you might have a vulnerability that sits on 5 different servers within your environment. We only count that as one vulnerability because it has one fix, and you can just replicate that fix onto the multiple servers. So we want to know the number of active IP addresses and the number of unique vulnerabilities, which in this particular case, we're sitting with less than one unique vulnerability per IP address, which is not too bad in terms of the severity of the vulnerabilities detected. The next important thing that we want to know is that out of these 111 vulnerabilities, how many of them already have ready-made exploits that are available? So ready-made exploit is a tool or a piece of code that someone can download to use that vulnerability to gain access to that specific machine. So it is very easy to exploit such a vulnerability because you don't really need to have any hacking experience as such, you'll probably find a very easy how-to video on YouTube to exploit that type of vulnerabilities. So as we can see here, about a third of the vulnerabilities that we found were actually had ready-made exploits, which is a bit of a concern. And then the next thing that we want to know is, out of the 193 active IP addresses, which IP addresses were responsible for these 111 vulnerabilities. So there we see that only 164 active IP addresses were responsible for those 111 vulnerabilities. The next important thing that we want to know is we want to know where the vulnerabilities came from. So we divide our vulnerabilities into 5 key areas, which is malware, access configurations, unsupported software, security configurations, and then patching. This enables us to write very specific root causes and recommendations to address the root issue around the vulnerability. There is absolutely no point in us providing a report to a client and telling them all the fixes of the vulnerabilities and how to do it, but we don't address the core issues. So this is what we try to do here. We show that, you know, the vast majority of the vulnerabilities came from inadequate patching. And then we have security configurations. We also have quite a number of unsupported software within the environment. And then, you know, your access configuration. And in this case, we had no malware or antivirus issues. So that is what we try and do with our reporting. Fred, if you can just move to the next slide. Another important factor that we work into our reports is the aging of the identified vulnerability instances. This is quite useful to our clients, because effectively what they would like to achieve is to have the majority of their vulnerabilities to be in the bottom 2 rows, the newer than 30 days and between 31 and 180 days. Once the vulnerabilities fall past 180 days, they become quite risky, because the longer a vulnerability has been out there, the more chances there are that hackers have developed ways and techniques to easily exploit those vulnerabilities. So these vulnerabilities that are older than 3 years, we shouldn't have any of them. The 1 to 3 years old as well. There should not be that many between 181 and 365 days. And we really want the majority of our vulnerabilities to lie in those bottom 2 categories. We also divide all of our vulnerabilities in our reporting according to the vulnerability family that they belong to. So we'll see there that there's CGI, abuses, domain name servers, databases, firewalls, general, miscellaneous, SNMP, service detection, web servers, Windows, and then your Windows Microsoft bulletins. And we just identify the number of IPs that were affected by those vulnerability families, and then the number of critical, high, medium, and low. Next slide. So like I mentioned before, in terms of our reporting, we want to get to the root causes of the vulnerabilities, and not just the fact that there are vulnerabilities within the environment. So in this case, missing patches was a big thing, unsupported end-of-life software or infrastructure, and security configurations. And then in line with this, depending on what the actual root causes are, we will develop detailed recommendations that will address those specific root causes. Next slide. Right, on the technical firewall assessments, here we use a tool called Nipper. So how Nipper works is that the client will give us a configuration file from the actual firewall, So it's not something that we connect to the firewall or do live scanning on the firewall because, ideally, you don't want that situation because you are going to get a lot of false positives, etc. So based on what you see on the screen, a technical firewall report, it's quite a lengthy report. The export from NIPA is generally anywhere between 800 and 1,000 pages, but then we condense that into a very detailed and focused report. So with NIPA, we are able to identify any administrative authorization, best practice, clear text, filtering, or routing issues within a firewall. And we can also identify how easy or difficult it might be to exploit those different weaknesses within a firewall. Next slide, Fred. We also do, this is basically a list of security weaknesses that was identified on a specific firewall. You can see it covers everything from user account management, physical and logical access restrictions, password complexity, denial of network communications traffic by default. All of these things are very key when we look at our firewalls and how we configure them. And we find that a vast majority of the organizations that I've dealt with in South Africa have outsourced their firewalls to a third party, and they aren't always aware of potential issues. So when we do these types of reports, it's very valuable to the clients. And a lot of these things can very easily be fixed. And when we have our perimeter security that is very strong, it makes the chance of a breach or a hack that much less. Next slide. So this is typically what we'll find as one of our detailed findings in a report. So this is filter rules that allow packets from any source to any destination. That is definitely a no-no when it comes to a firewall. We always want to make sure that we route the traffic from a specific source to a specific destination and vice versa. And here we can see that we've identified 4 rules that allowed any traffic, and these rules will either need to be amended or removed from the firewall to ensure better security of the firewall. Next slide. Okay, let's just skip that video. Yeah, let's talk about security and layers. So when we do our cyber assessments, we always bring it back to our security and layers. Even in our vulnerability assessments and our firewall assessments, we make mention of security and layers. So you can see here that we have our purple band, which is basically the perimeter security, where we have things like our firewall, gateway firewall, malware analysis. You can even have your email routing in this perimeter security layer. We then have network security. This is where we have things like a NAC or an endpoint profiler. When someone connects to the network, they need to be authenticated before they can do anything. Those types of controls sit in your network security layer. Then endpoint security is like your desktop firewall, your antivirus, your data layer protection, patch management, all of these things fall in there. Application security is Again, a strong focus on your database, your monitoring and scanning, again, your data layer protection, and then your data security is right on the inside. So you have things like your drive encryption, PKIs, data classification, data wiping and cleansing, all of those types of things. And then these 5 layers are then supported by your policies and your operations and monitoring and response and those types of things. So what we found is that the more layers you put between yourself and the more controls you put between yourself and the hackers, the more successful you will be in, reducing the number of attacks, or even, eliminating them altogether. Next screen. Okay, so cybersecurity controls auditing. This is where this is not really a technology audit. We use scanning tools and technology to evaluate the organization's security. This is more a general control type of review, and we really focus on prevention, deterrence, and alerts that come from the various controls that the clients may have implemented. Next slide. Some of the other controls that we also look at is detection, emergency preparedness, and response and recovery. Next slide. So effectively, when we do these types of cybersecurity controls, the things that we look at is our policies and procedures that we have in place, the use of strong passwords, user access management and monitoring, application security controls, the use of tokens and dongles. Physical security is becoming more and more important when we talk about cybersecurity. I've heard of 2 places in probably the last week where hackers physically broke into offices and placed listening and sniffing devices on networks. So physical security is very important. Network security, we also look at in terms of how the network is being monitored, how access is being granted, all those types of things. We look at firewall management, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. If there's a SIM in place, we look at the management of that. We look at incident response planning, traffic monitoring, encryption. All of these things are very important when we look at our cybersecurity controls. Next slide. Oh, there's some more. Traffic monitoring, encryption, antivirus, data layer protection, the use of honeypots to try and trap hackers that do come into the environment. Yeah, there are so many controls that we can look at. And, one of these key controls is obviously the human weakness. People can spend, or organizations can spend literally millions of rands on their cybersecurity, and it only takes one person to give away their username or password, and all of that money spent is then effectively rendered useless. So why are the hackers targeting humans? Because the simple answer is that humans are a lot easier to trick than a computer system. Humans can be manipulated through tactics like phishing, emails, phone scams, or impersonation. And the hackers exploit human emotions, trust, and curiosity to trick individuals into revealing sensitive information or taking malicious actions. the lack of cybersecurity awareness. What we find in a lot of organizations is that most organizations, their cybersecurity awareness is basically a poster on the wall saying that you should have a strong password, and this is simply not enough. People need to know about common cybersecurity threats, and they need to know how the hackers operate and how they use these weaknesses to gain access to systems. Then we also have a situation where specific individuals within an organization will have access to privileged access and credentials to do high-level administration and those sort of things. So, you know, oftentimes we find that system admins are quite easy to manipulate. If you put money on the table, they'll give you the admin username and password. So it's a very tricky area to ensure that from a human weakness perspective, that we provide our admins with the right level of training and awareness, and proper consequence management in terms of them just giving away their usernames and passwords. Next slide. So hackers also like to exploit human errors. Human errors could be things like weak passwords or a failure to update software. They generally capitalize on these mistakes, and they will then gain access through those means. Human trust and compliance. Unfortunately, humans are very trusting for the most part, and they will give away information without verifying the legitimacy of that specific request. I've had probably about 50 cases this year alone where people have paid organizations using the incorrect banking details because the email looked legitimate. So these are things that are happening on a regular basis. And then the biggest factor that leads to this human weakness is really the lack of security training and policies. If our policies aren't very clear and our users are not aware of the policies, and we don't do training on the policies, and we don't train people in terms of cybersecurity and how to protect themselves and how to protect the organization against hackers, we really are setting ourselves up for a disaster, because we find that about 65% of breaches are caused by the human weakness, and not through technology or a lack of technology. Right, I think that on a very high level is what we offer in terms of cybersecurity. It is, like I said in the beginning, it's a very high level presentation. I'm just covering some of the basics, and thank you very much for the opportunity for me to present this.